July 12, 1941. The outskirts of Smolensk, western Russia. Inside the cramped, suffocating interior of a T-34 medium tank, 23-year-old driver Mikhail Petrov pressed his ear against the metal housing of the engine compartment. His hands gripped the control levers, slick with sweat despite the early morning chill. Outside, German Panzer III tanks were advancing through the wheat fields, their guns searching for targets. But Mikhail wasn't watching the battle. He was listening. The V-12 diesel engine behind him roared at full throttle, 500 horsepower of raw Soviet engineering pushing the 30-ton beast forward at 30 miles per hour. But somewhere within that mechanical symphony, Mikhail heard something that made his blood run cold. Tick, 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 tick. A faint metallic knocking, getting louder, getting faster. His commander was screaming orders through the intercom. The gunner was traversing the turret. The loader was ramming another 76mm shell into the breech. But Mikhail raised his hand, the universal signal every T-34 crew learned to fear. "Oil pressure," he shouted. "We're losing oil pressure." His commander's voice crackled back through the chaos of battle. "How do you know? Check the gauge." Mikhail's response was drowned out by an explosion nearby. But if anyone had heard him, they would have caught the bitter irony in his voice. "What gauge?" This is the untold story of how Soviet tank crews drove into battle without one of the most basic instruments in mechanical engineering, and how listening for the sound of impending engine failure became a survival skill as critical as loading a gun or spotting enemy armor. This is a story about industrial desperation, battlefield ingenuity, and the brutal mathematics of total war. This is the story of how the Soviet Union fought the largest mechanized war in human history while their tank drivers pressed their ears to hot metal and prayed they could hear death coming before it seized their engines solid. To understand how the Soviet Union ended up sending tanks into combat without oil pressure gauges, we need to go back exactly 8 months earlier to November 1940. At the Kharkov locomotive factory, renamed Factory Number 183 under Stalin's industrial reorganization, chief designer Mikhail Koshkin was dying. The 42-year-old engineer had contracted pneumonia during the brutal winter test drive of his revolutionary tank design, the T-34, from Kharkov to Moscow and back, a journey of over 1,500 miles through snow and ice that he insisted on making to prove his creation's reliability. But even as tuberculosis ravaged his lungs, Koshkin continued refining his masterpiece, the tank that would eventually be credited with turning the tide of the Eastern Front. The T-34 was genuinely revolutionary. Its sloped armor could deflect German anti-tank rounds that would punch straight through any other Soviet tank. Its wide tracks distributed weight so effectively it could cross swamps and snow that would trap German panzers. Its 76.2mm gun could knock out any German tank from 1,000 meters. And its diesel engine, the V2, meant it wouldn't explode into a fireball the moment an enemy shell penetrated, unlike the gasoline-powered German tanks. But revolutionary design and wartime production are two very different challenges, and as Koshkin lay dying in his hospital bed in September 1940, he knew the industrial reality his tank would face. The Soviet Union in 1940 was an industrial colossus built on the backs of purges, forced collectivization, and the blood of millions. Stalin's 5-year plans had transformed an agricultural backwater into the world's second-largest industrial economy in barely a decade. Entire cities had been built around single factories. The Magnitogorsk steel complex in the Urals employed 250,000 workers. Tractor factories had been converted to produce tanks. Locomotive plants now churned out aircraft engines. It was industrialization through sheer force of will, and the human cost was staggering, but it was also chaotic, desperate, and perpetually short of everything, especially skilled labor and precision instruments. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht smashed into Soviet defensive lines with 3.8 million men, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft. The Soviet Western military districts were annihilated in the opening weeks. By July, German forces were approaching Smolensk, just 250 miles from Moscow. Soviet tank losses were catastrophic. In the first 3 weeks of the war, the Red Army lost over 11,000 armored vehicles. Entire mechanized corps simply ceased to exist. The pre-war tank force of over 20,000 vehicles was being destroyed faster than Stalin's generals could count them. Factory number 183 in Kharkov, the birthplace of the T-34, was producing tanks at maximum capacity, but maximum capacity in 1941 meant cutting every possible corner. The factory floor was a scene of controlled chaos. Workers, many of them women and teenagers who had never seen a tank before June, welded armor plates with techniques they'd learned days earlier. Engines were assembled by farm boys who'd been tractor drivers 6 months ago. Quality control meant checking if the turret could rotate and if the gun could fire. Everything else was secondary to the singular imperative: more tanks, faster. And this is where the oil pressure gauge problem began. Oil pressure gauges are precision instruments. They require calibrated springs, accurate dial faces, sealed housings, and most critically, they need to be manufactured to exacting tolerances. In peacetime, these components were imported from Germany and Czechoslovakia or produced in specialized instrument factories in Leningrad and Moscow. But by August 1941, German armies were besieging Leningrad and approaching Moscow. The instrument factories were being evacuated or converted to ammunition production. Import pipelines had been cut the moment the war started. And even if gauges had been available, installing them properly required trained technicians, rubber gaskets, copper fittings, and installation time that simply didn't exist when the factory was expected to push a finished tank out the doors every 2 hours. So Soviet industrial planners made a calculation. They could wait until proper instruments were available and produce fewer tanks, or they could eliminate non-essential components and produce more tanks immediately. In the brutal mathematics of 1941, when German panzers were advancing 50 miles a day, when entire Soviet armies were being encircled and destroyed, when the survival of the Soviet Union hung by a thread, the choice was obvious. Oil pressure gauges were declared non-essential, temperature gauges, non-essential, fuel gauges, barely essential. They were installed only when available. The tanks would go to war incomplete, and the crews would have to adapt. But here's what makes this story more than just a tale of industrial desperation. Soviet tank drivers didn't just accept the situation and hope for the best. They developed an entirely new way of operating their vehicles, a technique that combined mechanical intuition with survival instinct. At training facilities behind the lines, instructors taught new drivers how to read their engines through sound and vibration. They learned that a properly lubricated engine has a specific pitch, a particular rhythm. They learned that when oil pressure drops, metal parts that should be separated by a microscopic film of lubricant begin to make contact. First, it's a slight change in the engine note, a subtle roughness, then comes the ticking, light and irregular, then the ticking becomes knocking, steady and ominous. And if you hear the knocking become a grinding, you have perhaps 60 seconds before the engine seizes completely, and your 30-ton tank becomes a stationary coffin in the middle of a battlefield. Experienced drivers developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to these sounds. They could distinguish between the normal mechanical clatter of a V2 diesel underload and the specific frequency of bearing wear. They learned to feel vibrations through the control levers that indicated developing problems. Some drivers claimed they could smell oil burning before the engine began to overheat. It wasn't supernatural at all, of course. It was simply human adaptability under pressure, the same trait that allows fighter pilots to sense enemy aircraft before they see them, or submarine sonar operators to hear torpedo signatures in ocean noise. But in the T-34, this ability literally meant the difference between life and death. Let me give you a specific example of how this played out in combat. In October 1941, during the desperate defense of Moscow, a T-34 company commanded by Captain Dmitry Lavrinenko was conducting a fighting retreat near Volokholamsk. Lavrinenko, who would become the highest-scoring Soviet tank ace of 1941, with 52 confirmed kills before his death in December, was legendary for his ability to keep damaged tanks operational. In one engagement, his driver reported hearing the telltale knocking sound during a battle with German Panzer IVs. They were outnumbered 3-1, already in combat, with no time to stop and check the engine. Lavrinenko made an instant decision based entirely on the driver's auditory diagnosis. He ordered the driver to reduce engine RPMs slightly, which decreased power but reduced stress on the failing oil pump. They continued fighting, destroyed 2 German tanks, and limped back to Soviet lines with the engine still running. A post-battle inspection revealed that the oil pump had indeed been failing and would have seized within minutes at full throttle. The driver's ears had saved the tank and the crew, but not every crew was so fortunate. Soviet tank loss reports from 1941 and 1942 are filled with entries describing tanks abandoned due to mechanical failure during combat or retreat. Without instruments, drivers often couldn't distinguish between minor problems that could be ignored and catastrophic failures that required immediate shutdown. Some drivers, hearing unusual sounds, would shut down their engines prematurely, leaving their tanks stranded on roads clogged with retreating forces. Others, desensitized to constant mechanical noise or simply inexperienced, would miss the warning signs entirely and run their engines until they seized solid, the pistons welding themselves to the cylinder walls as metal expanded beyond tolerance in the absence of lubrication. The German armies, meanwhile, were experiencing their own mechanical problems, but of a very different nature. German tanks were precision machines with complete instrument panels. Panzer III and IV drivers had oil pressure gauges, temperature gauges, fuel gauges, and even hour meters to track engine running time. These instruments were manufactured to exact specifications by companies like Bosch and Telefunken, installed by trained technicians, and calibrated precisely. When a German tank driver saw his oil pressure gauge needle drop, he knew exactly what was happening and could make informed decisions. But this precision came at a cost. German tanks were harder to produce, required more skilled labor, and were more difficult to maintain in field conditions. When instrument panels were damaged in combat, they often couldn't be repaired without factory support. German tank production in 1941 totaled 3,790 vehicles. Soviet production that same year, despite the chaos of evacuation and the loss of major industrial centers, reached 6,590 tanks, with T-34 production specifically hitting 2,996 units. Here's the crucial question that Soviet planners were grappling with. Is it better to have 1,000 tanks with complete instruments or 2,000 tanks without them? Is it better to have crews that can monitor their engines precisely or crews that learn to listen and adapt? In 1941, facing an existential threat, the Soviet Union chose quantity over precision, and that choice probably saved them from defeat. Because even with all their mechanical problems, even with drivers pressing their ears to hot metal and praying, the T-34s kept coming. Every time the Germans destroyed 10 Soviet tanks, 20 more appeared. The Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy that could sustain losses they couldn't comprehend. The situation reached its crisis point during the Battle of Moscow in December 1941. Temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius. German vehicles, designed for European warfare, froze solid. Their gasoline engines wouldn't start without prolonged heating. Their narrow tracks sank into snow, but the T-34s, with their diesel engines that could be started with compressed air and their wide tracks that distributed weight, continued to operate. Soviet counteroffensives threw hundreds of T-34s at exhausted German positions. Many of these tanks had no gauges, many had inexperienced crews, some broke down, some were destroyed. But enough survived, enough pressed forward, enough killed German tanks and trucks and artillery pieces that by January 1942 the Wehrmacht was in retreat for the first time since the war began. And this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. Throughout 1942, as Soviet industry was reorganized in the Urals and beyond the reach of German bombers, production capacity increased dramatically. Factory number 183 was evacuated from Kharkov to Nizhny Tagil in October 1941, a journey of over 1,000 miles that took weeks and cost dozens of lives. But by spring 1942, the factory in its new location was producing more T-34s per month than it ever had in Kharkov. The Stalingrad tractor plant, even while fighting raged in the city itself, continued assembling tanks until German troops were literally fighting in the factory halls. Soviet tank production in 1942 reached 24,446 vehicles, more than triple the 1941 output. But here's the remarkable part. Even as production increased and supply chains stabilized, oil pressure gauges remained scarce throughout 1942 and much of 1943. The Soviet industrial system had adapted to their absence. Training programs had formalized the acoustic monitoring technique. Maintenance manuals included sections on identifying engine problems by sound. The absence of instruments had evolved from a desperate improvisation into accepted doctrine. Why divert manufacturing capacity to instruments when drivers had proven they could operate effectively without them? Why spend resources on precision gauges when those same resources could produce more ammunition, more armor plate, more engines? This pragmatic attitude horrified Western observers. When American and British officers inspected Soviet tank factories in 1943 under the Lend-Lease program, they were stunned by what they considered crude manufacturing standards. American tanks like the M4 Sherman had complete instrument panels. British tanks like the Churchill had even more extensive instrumentation. To Western eyes, sending tanks into combat without basic gauges seemed criminally negligent, but the Soviet response was brutally pragmatic. Western tanks had instruments, but they also had far lower production numbers. The United States produced 49,234 tanks during the entire war. The Soviet Union produced 105,251. When you're producing tanks on that scale, in factories that were literally built from scratch in the middle of nowhere in under 6 months, precision becomes a luxury you can't afford. The tide began to turn at Stalingrad. From August 1942 to February 1943, the most brutal battle in human history consumed armies and cities. Soviet tank production was critical to the victory. T-34s poured into Stalingrad at night, crossing the Volga on barges under German artillery fire, driven straight from the tractor factory a few miles away with fresh paint barely dry. Many still had no gauges, many broke down. The frozen ruins of Stalingrad were littered with abandoned vehicles, German and Soviet alike. But the Soviets could replace their losses. The Germans couldn't. When the encirclement closed on November 23, 1942, trapping 300,000 German soldiers, it was Soviet armor that sealed the ring. And when the spring thaw came in 1943, it was Soviet tanks that began the long advance westward. Kursk, July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, over 6,000 armored vehicles clashing across the steppes of central Russia. The Germans attacked with their newest weapons, the Panther and Tiger tanks, magnificent machines with long-barreled 75mm and 88mm guns, thick frontal armor, and yes, complete instrument panels. But they attacked with fewer than 300 of these new tanks, supplemented by older Panzer IIIs and IVs. The Soviets countered with over 3,000 tanks, the majority T-34s. Many still lacked proper instrumentation, but by now Soviet crews were veterans. They knew their machines, they knew the sounds of a healthy engine and a failing one. They knew how to nurse a damaged tank back to repair depots. They knew how to push their vehicles to the absolute limit and recognize when that limit had been reached. The Battle of Kursk was a German disaster. Over 3,000 German armored vehicles were destroyed or damaged. The Wehrmacht never recovered. From Kursk onward, the Red Army was on the offensive, pushing west through Ukraine, through Belarus, through Poland, all the way to Berlin, and all the way T-34s were at the forefront, their drivers still listening to engine sounds because instruments remained a low priority even as production quality improved in other areas. It wasn't until late 1943 that oil pressure gauges began appearing regularly in T-34 production. Not because Soviet industry suddenly developed a conscience about crew safety, but because the production situation had stabilized enough that instruments could be manufactured and installed without affecting output numbers. By 1944, most new T-34-85s, the upgraded model with an 85mm gun, came with full instrument panels. But by then, the damage was done. Or rather, the adaptation was complete. An entire generation of Soviet tank drivers had learned to operate without gauges, and many preferred it that way. Instruments could fail, needles could stick, readings could be wrong, but their ears never lied. Let me share one more story that captures the strange legacy of this situation. In 1945, as Soviet forces pushed into Germany, a T-34 unit liberated a German tank repair depot near Dresden. Inside, they found dozens of Panther and Tiger tanks in various states of repair. Soviet mechanics examined these vehicles with professional curiosity. The Germans had been meticulous. Every tank had detailed maintenance logs. Every instrument had been calibrated. Every gauge was functional. The Soviet mechanics were impressed by the precision, but also somewhat bemused. One mechanic, a veteran who'd been building T-34s since 1941, was quoted in a post-war interview as saying, "They had beautiful instruments, perfect gauges, everything measured precisely, but they still lost." This comment captures something profound about the Eastern Front. The Germans fought with precision and lost. The Soviets fought with improvisation and won. The absence of oil pressure gauges wasn't a flaw in Soviet tank design. It was a feature of Soviet industrial reality. It was a choice made under duress that turned into doctrine, then into culture. It represented the fundamental difference between two approaches to warfare, the German emphasis on quality and technical superiority versus the Soviet emphasis on quantity and adaptability. The human cost, of course, was staggering. Soviet tank crew casualties were astronomical. The average life expectancy of a T-34 driver in 1941 was measured in weeks. Many died in combat, but many also died or were seriously injured in accidents caused by mechanical failures that could have been prevented with proper instruments. A driver who couldn't see his oil pressure building up might push his engine until catastrophic failure occurred, potentially causing fires or explosions. A driver who couldn't monitor engine temperature might not realize his cooling system was failing until the engine was irreparably damaged. These weren't just mechanical failures, they were human tragedies, young men and women dying because their country couldn't provide them with a simple gauge. But here's the uncomfortable truth that historians still grapple with. If the Soviet Union had insisted on equipping every tank with proper instruments, if they had prioritized quality over quantity, they almost certainly would have produced fewer tanks, and with fewer tanks they might have lost Moscow in 1941, they might have lost Stalingrad in 1942, they might have lost the war. The gauges, or lack thereof, weren't just a technical issue. They were part of the brutal calculus of total war, where leadership had to weigh individual lives against collective survival. After the war, Soviet tank design evolved significantly. The T-54, which entered production in 1947 and became the most produced tank in history with over 95,000 units built, had a complete instrument panel. Oil pressure gauge, temperature gauge, fuel gauge, all standard equipment. Soviet industry had recovered and modernized. The desperate improvisations of wartime were replaced with peacetime standards. But the institutional memory remained. Soviet military doctrine continued to emphasize quantity over quality, mechanical simplicity over technical sophistication. Western tanks got more complex, with sophisticated fire control systems, stabilization, and eventually computers. Soviet tanks remained relatively simple, maintainable by conscripts with minimal training, and produced in enormous quantities. The T-34 itself remained in production until 1958 and in service with various armies well into the 1990s. Over 84,000 were built, making it the second most produced tank in history. Its influence on tank design was profound. The sloped armor concept became standard. The Christie suspension system was widely copied. The emphasis on mobility and firepower over armor thickness influenced decades of subsequent designs. But perhaps the most lasting influence was the philosophy it represented. A weapon system doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be good enough, available in sufficient numbers, and operated by people who can adapt to its limitations. Today, when we look at a beautifully restored T-34 in a museum, instrument panel complete with all gauges properly installed, it's easy to forget the desperate reality of its wartime service. It's easy to see it as just another tank, another piece of military hardware from a long-ago war. But for the men and women who drove these machines into combat, who pressed their ears against hot metal and listened for the sounds of death, who learned to read mechanical health through vibration and noise, the T-34 was something else entirely. It was a lifeline and a death trap, a marvel of engineering and a monument to industrial desperation, a weapon that won a war despite, or perhaps because of, its limitations. The story of Soviet tanks without oil pressure gauges is ultimately a story about human adaptability. Given the choice between having proper tools and having no tools at all, we'd all choose proper tools. But when that choice isn't available, when circumstances force us to make do with less than adequate equipment, humans find ways to adapt. We develop new skills, we create new techniques, we turn weaknesses into strengths, or at least into manageable problems. The T-34 drivers who learned to diagnose engine problems by ear weren't heroes because they were given impossible challenges. They were heroes because they met those challenges and found ways to survive. So the next time you hear an engine running, any engine, take a moment to really listen. Listen to the rhythm, the pitch, the subtle variations that indicate health or stress. Think about what it would mean to stake your life on your ability to hear the difference. Think about driving a 30-ton machine at 30 miles per hour toward enemy guns, with no gauges, no instruments, nothing but your ears and your experience and your hope that you'll hear the problem before it's too late. That was the reality for thousands of Soviet tank crews. And somehow, improbably, impossibly, it was enough. If you found this story fascinating, if you learned something about World War II that you didn't know before, consider subscribing to the channel. There are countless untold stories from the Eastern Front, small details that reveal enormous truths about the war, the people who fought it, and the choices they made. History isn't just about the big battles and famous generals. Sometimes it's about the absence of a simple gauge and the sound of an engine that might be about to fail. Sometimes that's where you find the real story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.